I wrote down all the main events after the stuff I've been through already in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I already know that John doesn't record any of this stuff because that picks up at the feeding of the 5,000, which is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it's even farther in the story. From going through this, I'm learning that Matthew is just totally out of order, at least in this section. Everything is clumped together. It's like bullet points of all the main events, not in order. So, from where I left off, Matthew, from chapter 5 to chapter 9, verse 10, are these following events. The Sermon on the Mount, the healing of the leper, healing the centurion's servant in Capernaum. It does mention that he heals Peter's wife's mother, but that's already been covered. Then the calming of the storm, demons sent into the swine from the Gadarene demoniac, or the Gergesene demoniac, which is only said that way in Matthew. Mark and Luke calls it Gadarene, not Gergesene. After that, the man is lowered from the roof, healed, and then Jesus is accused of blasphemy. And then at the end of this section, Matthew or Levi is called, and then he eats with the sinners. The question of fasting does come up. Then this section in Mark has a lot of the same events. Starts with the man lowered from the roof, healed, and Jesus accused of blasphemy. Then Matthew is called, or Levi is called. They eat with the sinners. The question of the fasting. Then it goes on to some other stuff that's not included in Matthew. On the Sabbath day, they're eating corn, and the Pharisees get upset. He heals a man with a withered hand. He ordains the 12. That's in chapter 10 in Matthew, so that's later. Anyway, back to Mark. Ordains the 12. He's accused of being possessed by Beelzebub. Then the parable of the sower and the seeds on the good soil. He calms the storm, which happened earlier, or at least before some of the other main events, like the calling of Matthew in Matthew. Calms the storm, and then he sends the demons into the swine. Luke has a lot more events being covered. The large haul of fish and his final call of the 4 disciples. Then he heals the leper. Then there's the man lowered from the roof, and Jesus is accused of blasphemy. Then Levi or Matthew is called. Jesus eats with the sinners. The question of fasting, eating the plucked corn on the Sabbath, healing the man with the withered hand, ordains the 12, Sermon on the Plain, which is not the Sermon on the Mount, a different event. He heals the centurion's servant in Capernaum, raises a widow's son from death, which is only mentioned in Luke. John the Baptist is offended and questions Jesus. I'm pretty sure that's only here in Luke as well. Another thing only here in Luke is Jesus' first anointing in a Pharisee's house, with the ointment going over his feet, and the woman crying on his feet and wiping his feet with her hair. The parable of the sower and the good seeds on the good soil, calming the storm, and demons sent into the swine. So these are jumbled up between these 3 accounts. The accounts in Mark and Luke are much more similar. There's added stuff in Luke that's not in the other 2. And in Matthew, the calling of Levi comes after the man is lowered from the roof, after the demons are sent into the swine, and after the centurion's servant is healed. The healing of the centurion's servant comes first in Matthew, but after in Luke. We already know that Peter's wife's mother was healed because of the very clear timeline in Mark and Luke, so I'm just not even going to mention that. It's not going to be brought up as I'm writing this out. The demon sent into the swine, that is definitely after the calming of the storm, because that's when he arrives at the other side. But that's mentioned before even the man is lowered from the roof in Matthew. So Matthew is just all over the place. And I am just going to go with the order from Mark and Luke, except of course for the Sermon on the Mount, which does happen first, before the healing of the leper. So I'll have the order here. And just so that I'm not being lazy, I'm going to go through this myself, see how I think it goes, and then I'll check with how Michael Rood does it to see if he does anything differently. And if he does, I'll consider it. I've already tried to communicate with him, but some of the employees at his ministry, they just don't respond. I mean, they respond. They say, yeah, we're trying to always be in a search for truth, but he's really busy. So they're just not getting back to me, which I understand. He's been around for a long time. So I guess I'm just going to have to pick. The leper healed, it's mentioned in Matthew, Luke, and in Mark. But in Matthew and Luke, they are both the second things mentioned. The first thing mentioned in Matthew is the Sermon on the Mount. The first thing mentioned in Luke is the large haul of fish. And I am going to go with the large haul of fish first, because when the leper was healed, in verse 12 of Luke 5. This is after they forsook all and followed him, verse 11. Then in verse 12, and it came to pass, when he was in a certain city, behold, a man full of leprosy, who, seeing Jesus, fell on his face and besought him. So this is obviously a time later. There is no direct following of one event to the other. It's just another time in the future after this event. But in Matthew, after his Sermon on the Mount, even though Matthew is not the best for figuring out what the order is, in this event, it clearly says, chapter 8, when he was come down from the mountain, this is the mountain that he was preaching from, great multitudes follow him, and behold, there came a leper and worshipped him, saying, if you will, you can make me clean. And that's the leper that he heals. So there is a direct preceding of the healing of the leper being the Sermon on the Mount, which means that the haul of fish comes first, then the Sermon on the Mount, then the healing of the leper. So that's what I'll do. The order is, number 1, large haul of fish, and Jesus' final call to the 4 disciples. Then, number 2, Sermon on the Mount. Then, number 3, leper healed. Now, there was a mention in Michael Rood's videos that when Levi Matthew was called, that's when he begins his day-to-day account of the actions of Jesus. And it seems since the Sermon on the Mount, that extremely long speech that he gives was only recorded in Matthew. I thought that Matthew must have been called just before, or at least sometime before, so that he was there listening. But the thing is, he could have been there even before he was called, because he was already extremely famous. It said just before the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 4, there followed him great multitudes of people from Galilee and from Decapolis and from Jerusalem and from Judea and from beyond Jordan. He is extremely famous at this point in time. And Matthew, Levi, it says that after, let me go to the different accounts of when he was called. In Matthew, it's later on, 9. It says, and as Jesus passed forth from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at receipt of custom, and he said, follow me, and he arose, and he came to pass, Jesus went to his house, and they had dinner. And this is explained in Matthew, or at least could be explained in Matthew, since I know Matthew is pretty out of order. After the man was lowered from the roof, and he was healed. In Mark, though, it says, the man is lowered from the roof, and then immediately goes right back. The same thing from Matthew. He passed by, he saw Levi the son of Alphaeus sitting at the receipt of custom, and said to him, follow me, and he arose and followed him. And then they went into his house and they had a big meal. In Luke 5, he has his final call, he heals the leper, and then they lower the man from the roof, he heals them, and then right after that, verse 27, after these things he went forth and saw a publican named Levi sitting at receipt of custom, and he said, follow me. He's called Matthew in Matthew. So, after the man is lowered from the roof, directly after that, Levi is called. In all 3. But I don't know if the man lowered from the roof comes next. It might. In Matthew, it's totally out of order. Let me go back to Matthew and see what happened before this. This, in Matthew, is written after he passed over and came to his own city. And this is recorded directly after the event with the Gadarene demoniac or the Gergesene demoniac, and all the demons are sent into the swine. But again, that is way later in both Mark and Luke. So I'm just going to cut this out of the timeline, or at least from this order. I might have that next. Is there anything else that could come next? Probably not. Let me keep going in Matthew just to see if anything happens before that is clearly later. Before that, he rebukes the winds. Okay, he calms the storm. So that's what happens before. However, that is mentioned in Mark and Luke as directly before he sends the legion into the swine. So those are connected. I'm just going to remove that from the timeline here in Matthew because that is just totally out of order. It is there in Matthew, and I'll say it's there for Matthew, but it's going to have to be moved around. And the only other thing that's left in Matthew, because I already mentioned the healing of Peter's wife's mother, is the healing of the centurion's servant in Capernaum. And that is mentioned right after healing of the leper. In Luke, it is after healing of the leper, but it's not right after. It's not even mentioned in Mark, so I can leave that there, but there's going to have to be a bunch of stuff from Luke and Mark that happens before that. During the meal that Jesus is having, that Matthew invited him to, the question of fasting comes up because John the Baptist was very strict, very harsh, very demanding. He was very dedicated to holiness and righteousness, so they fasted a lot, but Jesus did not, and he answered that you can't fast while the bridegroom is with you or while the bride is with you, but when he's gone you will. Connected, then, I'll say connected, because it's very clear that the question of fasting comes right after the meal, so that's for sure. In the order, I'm definitely going to put the man lowered from the roof is next, because there's nothing else that's mentioned that would happen before this, so it's just by default next. And then right after that, Levi, Matthew is called. I'm pretty much done with Matthew. It just rushes through all these events. Both Mark and Luke go into the event of them plucking corn on the Sabbath and eating, and then both immediately go into the healing of a man with a withered hand. Both immediately go into Jesus ordaining the 12. That is mentioned in Matthew, but it's later on. I'll mention that this is also in Matthew 10. So after he ordained the 12, the next question is, in Mark, it follows with, he's accused of using the power of Beelzebub to cast out demons. And I don't think that's mentioned in Luke, although I know just from memory that is definitely in Matthew. I wonder where, though. Oh, look at that! The man with the withered hand. It's in Matthew 12. Matthew is just all over the place. Eating plucked corn on the Sabbath. Okay, that's also Matthew 12. Question about fasting. I wonder if that is here. John the Baptist offended is later on in Luke, but it's also later on in Matthew. Okay, I'm not going to get into that yet. I just want to know if the stuff that I have so far is in Matthew. Oh, that's it. Okay, Matthew 12, he is accused of casting out by the power of Beelzebub. And that is after John the Baptist from prison is offended. So in Mark, he ordains the 12, and then he's accused of using the power of Beelzebub. In Luke, he ordains the 12, and then later on, John the Baptist is offended. So there's no order there. However, in Matthew, John the Baptist is offended, and then he's accused of using the power of Beelzebub. So that might be the order, but Matthew is just totally out of order. Okay, just because of that, I think I will then put John the Baptist is offended before he's accused of the power of Beelzebub. So, ordains the 12. I'll put the Sermon on the Plain all the way to Jesus' first anointing. In between Mark here, when he's accused of being possessed by Beelzebub, because that does happen later in Matthew. After that, he gives the parable of the sower, calming the storm. Oh, okay, that works perfectly. Good.